today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute. My name is Kirsten Sehnbruch. I'm a British Academy Global Professor and a Distinguished Policy Fellow at the III. And today I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing this seminar entitled How Women Win the Latin American Presidency, which is part of the III Inequality Seminar Series. Today's speaker is Dr. Reyes-Housholder, who's an old friend from Chile. She is an assistant professor at the Instituto de Ciencia, Política at the Católica University in Chile. And she's also an associate researcher at the Multidisciplinary Social Science Center for Conflict and Cohesion Studies, a center very close to my heart, COES. So I'd like to ask the online audience to please keep yourself muted. And as usual, there'll be a chance for you to ask questions at the end, following the presentation, and we'll take questions from both inside the room and from the online audience. So I'm now going to hand over to you, Catherine. Many thanks and enjoy the talk.
Now I'm connected. Okay. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm very honored to be here to present this work. This is the International Inequalities Institute, and I would argue that one of the most egregious inequalities in the world that relates to the distribution of power between women and men in presidencies worldwide. So the most difficult kind of political power for women to obtain is arguably the most important, the presidency. Worldwide, it is less common for women to become presidents than prime ministers. And the usual and most legitimate way to attain presidential power is through elections. So women tend to win between 5 and 7% of elections across the world in presidential systems. And so because the presidency tends to be one of the most powerful political positions in presidential democracies, I suggest that it's this inequality between men's and women's access to presidential power that is one of the most egregious and to date understudied power inequalities in the world. So I'm writing this book, which seeks to develop a systematic theory of how women win presidential elections. This is a large project, a work in progress, so I appreciate any comments or questions that you might have at the end. So we can start by thinking a little bit more broadly, how do women become chief executives? How do women become presidents or prime ministers? Supply side theories would suggest that, more women legislators, you have more women with the political experience necessary to become chief executives. So these supply side theories would expect countries with more women legislators to be more likely to elect women national leaders. We can test this idea. So this figure shows the year of women's victories to chief executive offices, presidents, and prime ministers across the globe between 1997, when we have data, women legislators, to 2020. And so you see here the difference between the country's number of women legislators with the global average at the time of the victory. So this horizontal line shows at 0, shows that this country in particular elected a woman president or prime minister when it had exactly the world average of women legislators. So here, supply side theories would expect us to see countries electing more women presidents and prime ministers when they have more women legislators than the world average. What we see, though, is a little bit more complicated than what supply side theories would suggest. Essentially, there is a correlation between the number of women legislators and the probability of a country electing a woman president or prime minister, a woman prime minister, but their correlation doesn't exist between women legislators and the probability of a country electing a woman president. So this sort of makes sense because prime ministers come from the body of legislators. For presidents, it's a little bit more complicated. The story is a little bit not as supply side theories would expect. So what else could it be? How else could women obtain a chief executive office, specifically the presidency? There's a conventional wisdom that women do achieve this through family ties. And there's lots of examples of this. The Philippines, Corazon Aquino was elected president in 1986. when her husband was a prominent opposition leader. Park Geun-hye won the presidency in South Korea in 2012 as the daughter of a former dictator. Cristina Fernandez won the presidency in Argentina as a former first lady. And of course, Hillary Clinton was the only woman to obtain the presidential nomination in the US. She also happened to be a first lady. There's a lot of problems with these family ties explanations. And so I'm not convinced at all by these. First of all, they tend to exaggerate the role of male family members in explaining these women's victories. So in many of these cases, South Korea, the Philippines, Nicaragua, the husband or the father had died years or died decades prior to these women's presidential victories. So these family ties arguments tend to gloss over women's own agency in crafting the political strategies. These arguments fail to systematically think about how women become leaders of parties and these party-based mechanics for how presidential elections work. Finally, there is one study that suggests that family ties are becoming less and less important in determining how women become presidents and prime ministers worldwide. So what about mainstream accounts of presidential elections? Why can't we just turn to those to explain how women win the presidency? So the most prominent theory, argues that presidential elections are referendum on the parties in power. So if citizens are satisfied with the incumbent's performance, they vote to maintain them in power. If citizens are dissatisfied, they will oust those in power. And this theory, is developed primarily on the case of the US. It doesn't work so well when citizens are dissatisfied with the party in power, but there's multiple challenger parties who could be voted into office and then take over. Multi-party systems are more difficult for accountability theories to explain than two-party systems such as in the US. The main problem is with accountability theories, they're gender blind, okay? So they cannot tell us why women instead of men win the presidency. They tell us nothing about party nominations. And we know that only about 1 in 10 of presidential candidates, more or less, in Latin America are women. So what explains that? So that's why this project aims to develop a systematic theory of how women win presidential elections. Why Latin America? Okay, so this is a world map of democratic presidential elections for the past 30 years between 1990 2020. The concentration of, or the number of presidential elections that have been held and where women have won. As I mentioned before, women have won about 6% of the world's presidential elections during this period. And Latin America is the region of the world, I just point out, which has the highest concentration of democratically held presidential elections, okay? The rate of women's presidential victories is about 7%, very similar to the rest of the world. So we can look at Latin America because we have a lot of presidential elections to look at, but women's rates of winning are similar to the rest of the world. Maybe a theory based on Latin America could also apply to other presidential systems in other parts of the country or other parts of the world. So this is the agenda for the ambitious agenda for the rest of the talk. I want to start by explaining how the ways in which women and men win the presidency in Latin America are different, okay? And thinking about this a little bit more systematically can help us help motivate the reason why this project focuses mostly on how women obtain nominations of political parties that are well established rather than smaller new parties. I'll present a model of women's presidential election or presidential victories, which introduces two concepts, main concepts: parties, gendered incentives, and perceived potential. And then I want to illustrate some empirical implications of the theory on Latin America, the whole region, as well as some in-depth case studies of Chile and Brazil. We'll see if I get to Brazil, according to how much time I have. Women and men win the presidency differently in Latin America, okay? So men have and continue to enjoy diverse routes to winning presidential elections. Latin American men can win as incumbent candidates of the incumbent party, okay? They can win as citizens are satisfied with the person in power, and then they elect the candidate who is supported by that incumbent. They can also win the presidency as leaders of the major opposition, as Sebastián Piñera did in 2010. So But this is just the start. Latin America, or in Latin America, men can win via small and new parties. And actually, these figures are probably more familiar to many of you as they grab lots of headlines, right? So Hugo Chavez wins by creating a new party, okay? Rafael Correa as well, Jair Bolsonaro, and most recently, Javier Milei in Argentina. So there's a history in Latin America that continues today of men creating new parties or taking a very small party and then winning the presidential election.
There are lots of really nice guys there.
We can talk about them more later too.
Yeah.
Women, the key point here is that accountability theory, which I mentioned before, has a pretty hard time predicting this, okay? Why is it this tiny challenger party wins rather than this other challenger party? Here's a longer list of men who've won the Latin American presidency that way. Why does this matter? Unlike men, women don't do this. They haven't done this. That doesn't mean in the future they won't. But women tend to win the presidency in Latin America historically by leading major challenger parties or incumbent parties in particular. So the first two elections that you have of women, women's presidential victories in Latin America were women leveraging major challenger parties or coalitions, okay? And then we sort of had a wave of women winning the presidency as nominees of incumbent parties or coalitions. Most recently in Honduras, which is not here in this figure, she also won, Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, won as a leader of a major opposition party as well. So presidential, let's look at how well a key indicator of citizen satisfaction with the incumbent presidential approval ratings predicts the vote share of candidates from incumbent parties. So here we have all the candidates from incumbent parties the last 30 years or so, 1990 to 2020. And then we have the presidential approval ratings of the current president. How well does that predict vote share of those incumbent candidates? In general, pretty well. The correlation is 0.48, which is not too bad in social sciences. The women are here in the black dots, and the men candidates are in these white dots. So there's 11 women candidates nominated by incumbent parties or coalitions who are in this graph, and they seem presidential approval ratings do a fairly good job of predicting the first round vote share here. Okay, so to recap, so far, women and men win the presidency differently. So men have more diverse routes to the presidency. Women only win through incumbent parties and coalitions or major challenger parties and coalitions. Why does this matter? Well, victories of women by these incumbents via these incumbent parties and coalitions or these major challenger parties is not that surprising. Accountability theory does a pretty good job of predicting when these women are going to win and lose. This is not the main puzzle here. The main puzzle is how did women become nominees of these major parties in the first place? Okay, why do these parties turn to women at these points in time in these circumstances? Accountability theory tells us nothing about this, about when this can happen, and much of the project seeks to understand this indeed. So I propose a two-stage model where stage one is the party nomination stage, and stage two is the general election. And the key argument here is that we have to look at stage one in order to understand how women win. Okay. So the first, in a sense, dependent variable of the project is the gender, the sex of the nominee. So why do parties turn to women in the first place? Well, let's think about more systematically about who are the selectors in the case, who are the people in the party deciding who becomes the nominee. And so I argue that these can be party level militants through primaries. These can be party elites or coalition elites. And these party selectors can also be outgoing presidents as well. And these selectors have electoral, party building, and legacy goals, and they seek candidates with the right traits in order for them to achieve these goals. So these party selectors are rational strategic actors. In part due to women's historical marginalization, women are associated with these qualities of novelty and moral integrity. So gendered incentives is this first variable. What are the incentives driving party selectors' decision-making on who to nominate? This is sort of a visual representation of the three-level concept of parties' gendered incentives. And so here we have these selectors' goals. They want to win the election. They want to build the party brand and or, especially in the case of the outgoing president, want to improve or continue their positive legacy of the president. And then as I can talk more about this, but I argue essentially that women in presidential politics routinely are associated with the qualities of novelty and moral integrity, as well as to a lesser extent, maybe modernity and feminine leadership. So the argument here is that when selectors think they need these traits in particular in order to achieve their goals, win the election, build the party brand, pursue the legacy, then they become more likely to nominate women instead of men for president. But this is not the only variable, right, that can determine whether a party will nominate a woman or man. Perceived potential also matters. So the second independent variable refers to selectors' assessments of how well possible nominees can actually convey these traits. So they know they need to convey these traits, but which candidate in particular will be best suited for that. This variable can help us explain why parties nominate a particular woman versus another woman. Okay, you have two women in the running. Why would you go for this one over that one? But it also helps explain why many times when parties think that they need to signal novelty, moral integrity, they still go with a man. Okay, that men have these other ways of conveying those traits. The rest of the story is not that novel, to be honest. So in the model, satisfaction with the incumbent, I argue, does a pretty good job of explaining how these women win and lose. And I can talk more about voters' preferences in particular, but gender really matters in stage one. Okay, that's really where women are often not nominated, but once they are nominated, citizen satisfaction with the incumbent helps explain their victories and their losses. Okay. I think I lost that screen. So I've kind of been relying on that one a little bit. Thank you. So the stage one theory produces three probabilistic hypotheses regarding the impact of these parties' gendered incentives on women's presidential nominations. So I use proxies for gendered incentives, citizens' level of party identification, trust in parties, and perceptions of corruption in order to test some of these first expectations empirically. So I argue that, if women are associated with novelty and moral integrity, then party selectors become more likely to calculate that they need a woman candidate when party identification is decreasing. Why? Because then party selectors think they need something new. Something's going wrong. We need something new. Maybe we need to signal novelty. Okay. In particular, maybe we need a woman. So that's a first hypothesis to test. I argue that parties become more likely to nominate women candidates as well when citizens start to trust parties less. Okay, when party selectors see, oh, they're not trusting us as more, maybe we need to signal novelty, moral integrity. Let's go for women. The probability rises of women becoming nominees. And finally, when citizens perceive more corruption, party selectors think we need to signal, in particular, moral integrity. Maybe we should go for a woman. Okay, and so I built these logistical models using LaPop data from America's Barometer data on Latin America from 2004, 2019. Here are some of the results, basically showing that, as party identification levels go down, the probability of nominating a woman goes up. It's still not that high, okay? Even at very low levels of party identification, we're still only looking at 1 in 3 candidates are women, okay? In the region. As citizens start to distrust parties less, party selectors think we need women to signal moral integrity and novelty, and the probability of parties nominating women goes up according to these models. And then as citizens' perceptions of corruption increase, party selectors think, oh, we need women to signal moral integrity, so the probability rises somewhat as corruption rises. So that's just taking a look at, do these proxies for gendered incentives sort of track nominations of women to the presidency across the region sort of over time. But to really get at these, the full theory, we have to look at cases. So I'll talk about Chile right now, and then I'll see if I have how much time I have for Brazil. So I start with the case of Michelle Bachelet's first victory in Chile in 2005, 2006. Seems like so long ago in many senses. Here, the parties, the relevant selectors here were elites of the Concertación coalition. Kirsten has written on this, the Concertación coalition. And they had won Democratic presidential elections in 1989 and 1994, and debates over the weaknesses of the Concertación coalition started far before Bachelet's emergence. So in the late 90s, Concertación elites are thinking, we have some weaknesses. We really need a leader who can be new and modern and can emotionally reconnect with the citizenry, okay? And so in this sense, Concertación elites' coalition building goals years before Bachelet's emergence aligned with the need to select a presidential contender who could credibly demonstrate these traits of novelty, empathy, modernity that were historically associated with Chilean women in politics. So I also argue that, the Concertación selectors' electoral goals moved them to seek a candidate who was empathetic and honest as well. So Concertación elites who would determine who the coalition would nominate in 2005 viewed this conservative Joaquin Lavín as the primary threat to their grip on presidential power. And these Concertación selectors were looking at Lavín and thinking, oh, he has been relatively successful in his previous candidacy and in the polls because he's able to demonstrate change. He's able to demonstrate himself as an agent of change and sort of emotionally connect with citizens, especially those from the humble classes, okay? So they were thinking, the Concertación elites, we need a candidate who can compete with this Joaquin Lavín, specifically in outperforming him on these traits. One of the analytical advantages of looking at the case of Chile is that we had two women contenders competing at the same time. So this is where perceived potential becomes really important in thinking about the argument. So how well did selectors think Michelle Bachelet, at the time the defense minister, could convey these traits of novelty, empathetic leadership, and moral integrity compared to this other woman who was a viable presidential contender, Secretary of State Soledad Alvear. And so these two women sort of dominated in terms of favorability ratings compared to other male contenders in the Concertación who could have and wanted to become the presidential candidate. But I argue that both Bachelet and Alvear were able to sort of convey this novelty. Either one could have been the first female president, was well positioned to signal novelty and moral integrity. But the Concertación selectors were looking at these nationally representative polls and seeing how Bachelet specifically outperformed Alvear on some of these key traits: honesty and moral integrity. Both of these women performed better than Lavín on these key traits, okay? But the margin of overperformance was better for Bachelet than for Alvear. Okay, so arguably either could have won the election. But the Concertación ultimately goes with Bachelet instead of Alvear because of her how they viewed her performance on these desirable traits. Alvear drops out. Bachelet becomes the nominee of the Concertación. So what explains her victory? It's not too surprising, okay? So we can model the vote intention with data from the Centro de Estudios Públicos, CEP in Chile. And we see, Lagos's approval ratings, his favorability ratings, the president in power, that had a positive impact on vote intention. We also see that some of perceptions of Bachelet's qualities, that she was an honest person, that she worried about people, also did have a positive independent impact on vote intention there. This is not that surprising. Voters who approved of the president in power, Lagos at the time, had a higher vote intention for Bachelet in the second round, and those who viewed him more favorably also tended to vote more, intend to vote more for Bachelet. not too mysterious in that sense of how she won the election. What is mysterious is how she became the nominee. How much time do I have left? Great. Okay, so I'll talk about Brazil. Here I want to think about Brazil, where we have the Workers' Party selectors that were sort of dominated by the outgoing President Lula. Okay, thinking about 2010. So President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the current president of Brazil, okay, go back 13 years. He acted as the dominant selector of the Workers' Party. He had 80% approval ratings. He in many senses, he continues to dominate the party. Okay, but I argue that promoting historically marginalized groups was a fundamental ideological commitment of the PT, the Workers' Party, since its origins, and feminists in the PT played a relatively influential role in the party and on Lula's own decision-making. So PT selectors, specifically Lula's party building goals, included this idea of promoting historically marginalized groups, including women, okay? So in that sense, PT selectors' goals aligned with this idea of promoting novelty and electing the first woman president in Brazil. National surveys at the time as well showed that Brazilians did want to elect more women in politics, including a woman president. They were very much open to the idea of doing that, and not electing a woman president was viewed as an advantage rather than a disadvantage. I also go into a little bit of how the Mensalão scandal, and this was prior to Lula's reelection, but that created a need for the party to select a candidate who could convey moral integrity to improve the party's brand on corruption in particular. So, you know, surveys before Roussef's emergence showed that Brazilians associated women in politics with some very positive things. Honesty in politics, commitment to voters, for example. So just to summarize, PT selectors, most importantly Lula, faced these incentives to nominate a presidential candidate who could convey novelty, serve as the first woman president, and moral integrity, traits associated more with women than men in politics. Okay, so then gender incentives crystallized in the case of Brazil. How did Rousseff in particular achieve how was she able to convey these traits to the PT selectors and sort of convince Lula in particular that she was the best positioned to convey this moral integrity and novelty as the first woman president? So if we go back we dig deep into some biographies of Rousseff and to some secondary accounts. So we can see that the PT selectors were very concerned with how Rousseff would be perceived by the PT militants and by Brazilian population in general. So excerpts from some biographies show that PT leaders, prior to nominating Rousseff, conducted polling. Because Rousseff was so unknown to the public, they wanted to see how well is this candidate actually going to perform if we actually nominate her. And they found pretty consistent evidence that voters liked the fact that she was a woman, and they liked the fact that she demonstrated these traits, for example, novelty and moral integrity. Lula, at some points in the biography as well, is quoted as saying, you know, I think we should go for Rousseff, paraphrasing, right? I think we should go for Rousseff instead of this other man because she will be able to convey novelty to the public. So in addition to examining surveys and secondary accounts of Lula's and the PT's decision-making, I seek to understand party selectors' perceptions of Rousseff's potential as a presidential candidate through campaign discourse. So the premise here is that campaign discourse is strategically designed by the party leaders and selectors to highlight what they believe are the candidate's strengths. We can understand some of the party's decision-making by looking at these campaign discourse and these campaign advertisements. So many of Rousseff's advertisements prominently display this idea that she would become the first woman president of Brazil. And they also emphasize other gendered qualities of her. Being a woman for the PT was seen as a strength rather than a weakness, potential weakness. And the rest of the story is not that surprising. So Lula's, very, very high approval ratings, as I mentioned before, 80% had a positive impact on vote intention for Rousseff. There's not much new here, and many other studies have looked at this as well. So just to conclude, I suggest that, one of the most egregious power inequalities, again, refers to this men's dominance in chief executive offices worldwide. It's especially difficult for women to win presidential elections, and we don't have a systematic theory to explain this. So as I've argued throughout the talk, we have to start with stage one in order to understand how this happens. So gendered incentives, as I've argued, is a key starting point. So they influence selectors' decision-making throughout Latin America when we look at all political parties in the region over the past 15 years or so. And then we can look more deeply into case studies of Chile and Brazil to see how they crystallized prior to these women's nomination. But perceived potential also matters. Selectors have to be convinced that this woman, instead of this man or this other woman, is the best suited to convey these desirable attributes. And then again, once nominated, citizen satisfaction with the incumbent seems to be the real driver between these women's victories and their losses. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation that brings back many memories. So we're going to take some questions for the people online. Please raise your hand in the chat and copy or write your question into the chat, and we'll go back and forth. We'll start with the room. Any questions in the room? Yeah, Paolo first.
I have a request clarification about one of the first slides you've shown, which had on the horizontal axis time and on the vertical
The very
axis.
first one?
Yeah, the very first.
Great. We'll go all the way back.
Sorry. Okay, so here the idea is that you are trying to show. You are showing how this ratio changes through time, and there is no change. Okay, but at the same time, I expect there is a change in the denominator of the fraction there. So to me, it's a little puzzling. I've been thinking 2 or 3 minutes about how to interpret this. Can you give me?
Let me explain it a little bit more slowly and piece by piece. So we have countries that either elected presidents or prime ministers. So if you're a presidential system, then you're only going to elect a president. If you're a semi-presidential system, you could elect a president and or a prime minister at the same time. If you're a pure parliamentary system, then you just can elect a prime minister. And so then we have the country and we have the year. So this is true. Over time, countries have more and more women legislators over time. This figure, in a sense, controls for that in the sense of thinking, okay, Ireland had exactly the same world average of women legislators in 1997 when it elected a president, okay? So we would think that countries such as Finland, semi-presidential system, they can elect women prime minister and a woman president, and they've done that 4 times, okay? And each time they've done so, they've had a much higher amount of women legislators than the world average at the time. So the world average is moving over time, and this is essentially controls for that. You could interpret supply side theories in a different way and not control for time and not think about how time varies. And then we would expect over time countries to elect more and more women to the presidency as well, which I have another figure that shows that over time countries do tend to elect more women presidents and prime ministers over time. This is controlling for time. In that sense. So the case of Brazil, they elected their first women president, had a much lower number of women legislators in the presidency when they elected Rousseff, and then obviously they re-elected her again. So that's not easy for supply side theories to explain. Why would a country with so few women legislators end up electing a woman president? Okay, and Chile is, somewhere around the world average at the time. Yeah, Brazil appears here 2 times. This is every election of women presidents and women prime ministers. Does that?
Yeah, I mean, so the absence of the absence of a correlation is basically the absence of a trend.
So there is a correlation between women legislators and the prime ministers. Yes, but that doesn't hold up for women presidents. So there's no statistically significant correlation, I should say, statistically significant correlation between the quantity of women legislators and the probability of a country electing a woman president. So I think that supply, like measuring supply this way in terms of women legislators, yeah, that does seem to make sense for parliamentary systems. And I think that if you build a theory of how women become prime ministers, you might want to start there, in fact, start at that. But for presidents, it simply works differently. The women here that I mentioned in Chile and Brazil, they were ministers. They had no legislative experience. In fact, neither had won an election before becoming president. In that case, it's different. In the case of Argentina, Cristina Fernández had extensive legislative experience before becoming president. But it's, and so I think this works better for prime ministers than for presidents to start out with. Thank you for allowing me to clarify that, because there's a lot going on in this figure and that at the same time.
Lisa?
I have no actual questions, but more like clarification issues that I like to more. At some point, you show some graphs of how trust in politicians or government, sorry, I cannot recall exactly the variable used, or party identification, etc., how they are related or not, the probability of having a female nominate, right? But if I understand it correctly, you bundle all the countries together to calculate that.
Yeah.
I'm not a big fan of bundling Latin American countries together because, well, I'm still to be convinced of what a Highland, Bolivian, and a Uruguayan living in Montevideo have in common. But so if you look at the country level, is this trend prevalent everywhere? Or you only find this effect when you look at the aggregated data? And the second question is, it's in your theoretical model, the role of party internal party figures is important in the nominating process, right? The selectors.
Yep.
But in the Brazilian case, for instance, if we pay attention to what happened in 2009, 2010, there was no nominators. Like Lula picked Dilma and said, "You be the candidate. Yep. Doesn't matter what other people say." Yep. And basically what happened was a transfer of Lula's approval rating to Dilma Rousseff, and then she got elected. So I'd like to hear a little bit more how your model fits to this specific Brazilian case.
Sure.
Right? Because that's probably the most important election in the Brazilian case, to understand how and why a woman can be elected or nominated and eventually elected president.
Right. Okay. So let me go back to that slide on those results, which is a little bit further back here. So these are results from models that look at all political parties in Latin America from 18 countries, 2004 to 2019. So why do we do this? We want to figure out if there's trends across the region. This is not a deterministic argument, it's a probabilistic one. So in that sense, I think that modeling it this way is justified, okay? So this won't tell you exactly what the differences between Bolivia and Uruguay are, but we think of parties as seeking votes and trying to put forth the candidate that could best convey the traits that they think in order to achieve, in particular, their electoral goals, okay, and to score them points among voters. So we could disagree on, in terms of epistemology, right? Can we compare these parties? Let's just assume that these parties tend to select candidates that they think will elect, that will get them the most votes. Now we can make this more complicated. You can think about parties. Parties don't really just want to win. They want to, like small parties, green parties, for example, they really care about a specific issue in particular, and they're going to select their candidate according to that. That could be, okay, there certainly are outliers, but if we want to pick up sort of somewhat across time trends across these 18 countries, this is one way to do it. This is only looking at the probabilistic relationship between these proxies for gender incentives and the probability of nominating women for president. So I totally understand. Bolivia is different from Uruguay. And Uruguay, interestingly, has never nominated, in this data set, never nominated a woman for president. Why would Uruguay, which is known as being a socially progressive country, do that? In a sense, I would argue, they don't have these incentives, okay? So party identification in Uruguay in particular is not that bad compared to the rest of Latin America. They haven't experienced this sort of severe decline in party identification, distrust in parties, and corruption. So that could be one contextual country level variable that is taken account for in the model.
It's still controlling for a country in the model is still give you a linear trend, right? It's not going to give us what are the differences across cases. That's what bothers me most. But sorry.
We're not trying to explain differences across cases with these models. The goal of the models is to detect these broader empirical trends in the data. But we do want to see the similarities between Chile and Brazil, which I argue, I didn't talk about this here, but are pretty different cases on Michelle Bachelet versus Dilma Rousseff. I could talk more about how they're different in particular, but Michelle Bachelet was famous, for example, for this feminine leadership. Rousseff was not, clearly was not. She was more known as taking a more masculine leadership style. But she did represent novelty, and she did represent moral integrity and modernity, is where the argument goes. Let me get to your next question about Lula. Right, so Lula dominated the process. So I talk about PT selectors. I really should just say Lula, but I don't think that Lula was completely thought that he really could pick anyone without convincing sort of the other PT leaders that she was the best one. So what evidence do I have of this, right? Of Lula talking to other PT leaders about nominating Rousseff instead of a man. Okay, he did talk about that. They conducted polling before nominating her. What does that suggest? Oh, they were kind of concerned about how well she could perform. So the implication of this is like, had Rousseff, the poll showed that Brazilians did not want to elect a woman president, that they weren't interested in Rousseff, it was totally unknown, that they actually prefer male leaders, and they prefer sort of more traditional leadership, and we're not concerned with novelty and modernity, signaling modernity, that maybe Lula would have gone with someone else, Ciro Gomes in particular, who wasn't from his party, but was in these discussions. And so that's where the perceived potential variable comes in particular.
I'm going to take you wanted to ask a question?
There was a question online.
Online, yeah. Should we go online first?
Are you me? Okay, sorry, I'm not in the flow of the room, but hi, thanks so much for your presentation, Catherine, and sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I have two questions. The one I feel like is a little bit of an unfair question, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. I was just wondering if you can think, so I think it's unfair because I think my job as the question is to think of the case, but can you think of a case that like meets the conditions of these incentives, but yet we don't see a female candidate, and why would that be? So is there, you've shown us cases where it does fit the model, but are there cases where we think, where the conditions are there and kind of we have a different outcome? So that's the one question. I was trying to rack my brain and I couldn't think of one, but I was wondering if you did and if you had an answer to that. And the second question is, what does this tell us about gender equality more generally? So are you explaining how the first or second, how does a woman get elected to the presidency once or twice. So if there's this issue of novelty, if more and more women become presidents, then do the incentives to nominate them disappear? And then, is this kind of in a way a depressing story that they have a one, two chances and then that's it, because then it's not novel anymore, and so we have to wait for a while until it becomes new again. Just wondering about that.
Thank you. I suppose I could go back to the case of Uruguay in particular, and thinking about two main parties in a country where things aren't going that badly in terms of party identification and trust in parties. As I mentioned before, Uruguay is one of those countries where corruption's not an enormous issue, and the corruption scandals are a much lower scale than, for example, in Brazil and in other countries. Thinking about the Mensalão scandal in particular. So here in the models, we do get variation of whether parties nominate women or not. And so I don't have a deep case study of this. Why do these parties not nominate women in particular, given these conditions? But we can look at, again, across the region, when do parties tend to even more so not nominate women? When are they the least likely to nominate women? Tends to be when things are going pretty well. When party identification levels are not decreasing very quickly, when citizens continue to generally trust parties, and when corruption is not so bad. I want to just add that these relationships too do actually hold for women legislators in Latin America. So there's a couple of other studies that have shown using similar data, but looking at when parties nominate women for the legislator, well, they actually tend to do so as well when party identification is going down, when citizens are trusting in parties less. And so there's a paper by Funk, Hinojosa and Piscopo that talks about women to the rescue. So when parties are in trouble, they start to go to women and nominate women for Congress in Latin America is the basic argument. I find similar patterns too in presidential nominations. Okay, so that point in particular can sort of generalize beyond the presidency. And when are parties particularly reticent in nominating women when things are going relatively well for them? Why change things up when things are going well? When things go badly, maybe we need something new. Maybe we need to nominate women as well. So is this a depressing story or not? So I started this entire research agenda looking for optimism. Women's presidential victories, that's kind of an exciting, optimistic thing to think about. And over time, I've become a little bit more pessimistic. So, thinking about when I started this, literally thinking about this in 2005, and then I'm watching Bachelet win, I'm watching Fernandez win, I'm watching in Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, Rousseff win. And then we had sort of a pause. Most recently, we had a win in Honduras. Next year, most probably Mexico is going to elect its first woman president, nominated by a well-established party. We have two women candidates there. Yet we have not had a case in Latin America of a country electing two different women. So these women won their re-elections, and I can go back to that slide too, towards the beginning. We had a trend of women winning through incumbent parties and winning their re-elections. Of course, then we know that Rousseff is impeached, right? So that you can do whole gendered, and there has been gendered analysis of the misogyny in her impeachment hearings. And then of course we have the rise of the far right in Brazil, and sort of a continuing presence there. Fernandez was reelected again, and then she served as vice president. I guess her future in politics in Argentina is more uncertain there. One of the points that had made me a little bit more depressed is that in none of these cases have women been able to handpick their successors and get them elected. Okay, so there's something gendered there as well. When we think of Bachelet, right, she was the most popular president in Chile. When she leaves, she comes back and sits out a term, comes back for re-election. but she's not able to get her candidate, Eduardo Frei at the time, elected. So these women, there's another part of presidential power of men being able to perpetuate through other men or through other women their power. But women, when they come to power, in order to, they don't seem to have as much success in electing their successors, handpicking them and electing them in any of these cases. So that makes it's a little bit less optimistic as well. The fact that we don't see countries electing more and more women presidents, at least to date, the same country electing different women. I do think that this novelty question always comes up, right? So once a woman, there's no longer a chance to become a first woman president. Is that good or is that bad? Okay. There's a lot of scholarship that thinks of novelty as sort of a bad thing because women are then seen as the other. And so this project thinks of novelty as actually providing an opportunity of women to show, okay, this is something new. I'm a pioneer for women in politics, and I'm going to create change. But so on one sense, we have less novelty. So maybe that's bad because they can't use that then in their campaigns and sell themselves that way. But maybe that's good. Maybe that'll help women become more normalized in politics. It's normal to have a woman president. And now we have, people in Chile, having grown up with a woman president, for example, as well as in Brazil. Do the sort of the failures of these women presidents then spread to other candidates, and do people then become more doubtful of women's leadership? Maybe. Okay, that's another research question. In particular, thinking about the case of Brazil and the rise of the far right after Rousseff's during and after her impeachment in particular. So I'm not entirely optimistic. I have some bad news in that sense, but most of these are just research questions that have to be further explored. Thank you, Hannah.
How many more questions in the room, just to sort of take up you and no? Anyone else? You? Okay, two. Shall we take the two questions together and in the interest of time?
Okay, thank you very much, and I appreciate your presentation. I would like to know if there could be a contribution in considering the electoral system and the quotas with legislators, because you said it is not correlated, but maybe we are missing that. And drawing on the works of de la Red de Politólogas, maybe
I remember.
I'm from Argentina, and Freidenberg and Suarez Cao in Chile, and other people drawing on this. Maybe it could. Another suggestion would be about considering, not a suggestion, of course, but thinking of candidacies. And so we have Fujimori, Bullrich in Argentina now, in Ecuador. There's many women candidates, and that would help considering the nomination process in the parties. I thought it would be helpful to think. Thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
I had three very little things.
Okay.
Just as a point of fact, you were making the point that the women haven't been able to pick their successors. But I thought Fernandez, through the difficult machinations of Peronism, did have an impact in choosing Alberto Fernandez. So I just wanted to check about that. Then a second one, and more of a comment on Rousseff and the rise of the far right. I'm not a political scientist, but I think you'd have to think of a reaction to Pétain rather than to Rousseff much more, right? Rousseff was always seen widely as Lula's creature, and the frustration and everything was with the party rather than with her herself. But you mentioned this gender thing, so I wanted to know what the evidence is on that as separate from the Pétain rejection. And lastly, you had a little model as you called it. Does that change when there are two women, like in the case of Mexico? So if there are two women, there's like a strategic game going on, isn't it? It's not. If I want to emphasize novelty, but the other person also picks a woman, how does that change things?
Yeah. Okay, great. So looking at electoral systems and quotas. So I think there's a mainstream literature in Latin American politics which really focuses on electoral systems and institutions. This is not so much of an institutional argument. So, and in the cases that I'm looking at, you can have, there's different ways of parties, if we think about institutions, different ways that parties nominate women. I didn't talk about Paraguay, but in the project as well, looking at Paraguay, which actually had primaries. And so they had, and they selected their nominee, a woman, and again, in that case, through primary systems. The Constitución was going to have a primary, and then Soledad Alvear dropped out of the race, and then Bachelet ended up being the default candidate. And then Rousseff, again, everything was pretty perfunctory. Lula wielded all the informal power and was sort of a dedazo, him dominating that selection. In that sense, so we have variation in how these women became the nominees in terms of institutions. So I don't think that different institutions can necessarily guarantee that women are going to be nominated or they won't be nominated. I think that we see variation in that sense as well. If we think about quotas, okay, so quotas, what do? They're different in their efficacy, but essentially they seek they ultimately augment the supply of women legislators. So that's the goal, is to have more women's presence, particularly in Congress. So if we think about electoral quotas, we can think, I think a better measure to look there is simply the quantity of women who've been elected to Congress in that sense. And again, you know, Chile didn't have quotas at the time of Bachelet's election. And again, Brazil had very low number of women legislators when Rousseff was elected as well. So Argentina is famous for having quotas early on, right? And for having lots of women legislators, and we see women elected there. So there's variation there as well. I don't see quotas as an easy explanation to getting a woman president. Yes, it has had a major impact in the women's presence in Congress. I do think we need to think about how do we have sort of an institution or institutional rules of quotas. How could we use that on presidential elections for executive office? So how could that occur? That would be helpful to think about that, and maybe we would see greater gains in women's presence in presidencies worldwide, in particular in Latin America, if we had some kind of institution such as quotas that could help us get there as well. So thank you for that question. Yes, Fujimori Bullrich and candidates in Ecuador would be, you know, part of the data points in the regional models of when parties nominate women. So that data set, though, is only updated until 2019. So it doesn't include, for example, the most recent election race in Argentina, for example. And it should be updated. We should get that. Thank you for that point on Fernandez and Cristina Fernandez having an impact on choosing Alberto Fernandez. That's a very helpful point. When we think about Rousseff and the rise of the far right, there's a lot of literature on the far right in Europe, and there's a growing literature in Latin America which thinks about this in terms of gender. And as the far right, as sort of espousing more traditional gender norms. And so when we think of the discourse of some of these far right candidates in Latin America and in Europe, much of it is sort of trying to return women to their previous roles, to the more traditional roles, okay? And we see that in Rousseff's, as I mentioned, her impeachment hearings, with many of the misogynist comments that came out of there, that had nothing to do with the accusations at hand, but had to do with gender, okay? So it's hard to sort of ignore the advances in women's rights, the advances in LGBT rights as well in the region, and not think that could be related to backlash in the region against these broader advances in historically marginalized groups. And so there's growing research on this as well. Just for example, in Europe, there's studies of how those with masculine personalities tend to vote for the far right more, tend to prefer the far right more, and men in particular, men and masculine personalities, than those with neutral or feminine personalities as well. And so there's work in particular by Cristóbal Rovira, one of my colleagues at the Universidad Católica, who studies the far right. And there's growing research on gender and how that's related to the emergence, in particular in countries of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile as well, which we see the emergence of the far right there. What about when there's two women? So there's a few cases of women competing against each other. And so one of the first cases that comes to mind is thinking of Bachelet's reelection. So Bachelet in 2013 was competing against another woman from the opposition, Evelyn Matei, who was nominated by the conservative coalition. So neither woman was, claiming to become a pretty novelty in moral integrity. Bachelet was coming to be reelected. This argument tends to work best for women's initial elections. So I included these re-elections, these women getting reelected. But in these re-elections, novelty was not the major selling point of why they should elect me again, why they should re-elect me. It was based on past performance and things like that. But we do have a few cases. I will be looking at this Mexico case in particular in the coming months and just seeing how these women frame their competing discourse. One of them is going to become the first woman president in some cases. Again, we have to look at how these women first became the nominees and how they were perceived in terms of these traits, what the traits the parties were looking for and how these women performed on these traits. But looking at the discourse between these two women, I think will be interesting to look at as well. That's all for my answers there.
That's fantastic. I know how much work we can do getting all that information together. Thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for questions and see you soon.